Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away, and nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually feeling. A gap that can be quietly disorienting precisely because you don't have the vocabulary for it yet, and everyone around you seems to assume you're fine. I'd genuinely like to know if any part of this sounded like your own life, because I read every comment on these, even the ones that come in months after a video first goes up. And I've had some of the most meaningful exchanges of my week come out of a comment someone left at some odd hour half asleep, saying some version of, "This is exactly where I am right now." If that's you, don't hesitate to say so below. There's no judgment here, and honestly, hearing from you helps me know these stories are actually doing something useful out there in the world, not just accumulating views. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, because I'd hate for you to miss whatever comes next. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting at a kitchen table in a house you've lived in for 22 years, and your wife is looking at you across that table, the way she only looks at you when she's decided something and the decision is already final, even though the conversation hasn't technically started yet. You know that look. After 31 years of marriage, you know every version of it. The one that means she's annoyed but it'll pass. The one that means she's hurt and needs you to figure out why. And the one that means she has arrived at a conclusion and you can talk all you want, but the talking is mostly just a formality at this point. That last look is the one she was giving me the evening I told her I wanted to move to the Philippines. She said, very calmly, very clearly, the way Sandra always says the things she means the most, that if I moved to the Philippines, she would divorce me. Not separate, not take some time apart. Divorce. She said the word the way you'd say the name of a country you've never been to and have no intention of visiting, matter-of-factly, like the outcome was a geography she'd already mapped out and accepted. Then she poured herself another cup of tea and went back to reading her book. I'm Wyatt. I'm 68 years old. I've been in the Philippines for going on 2 years now. Sandra is asleep in the next room. She moved here 14 months ago, which means that approximately 9 months after she told me she'd divorce me if I came here, she bought herself a one-way ticket and flew 8,000 miles to join me. And I am telling you this, not because I want you to think I won, because I did not win. Nobody wins with Sandra. That's not how it works. But because the reason she changed her mind is the part of this story that I think actually matters, and I want to tell it properly. If this kind of story is something you want more of, go ahead and subscribe right now, because there's more of it coming, and I think you're going to want to be around for it. Let me back up to the beginning, or at least to the version of the beginning that explains how I got to that kitchen table conversation in the first place. Because I didn't just wake up one morning and announce I wanted to move to Southeast Asia. It was a longer road than that, the kind of road that looks, in retrospect, like it was always heading somewhere, even when you couldn't see where that somewhere was. I spent 33 years working in logistics management for a mid-sized manufacturing company based out of Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing that makes for interesting dinner party conversation, but solid, demanding work that I was genuinely good at, the kind of work where if you do it well, nobody notices, and if you do it badly, everyone does. I moved up steadily, managed progressively larger teams, spent an embarrassing percentage of my 40s and early 50s in airports and conference rooms, in cities that blurred together after a while, Birmingham and Minneapolis and Portland and Denver, the same rental car smell, the same hotel breakfast, the same version of my own voice, explaining the same things to different people in different buildings. I was competent and reliable, and I traveled too much, and I missed too many ordinary Wednesday nights at home. And I knew all of that while it was happening, and did it anyway, because that's what the job required, and I had gotten very good at telling myself that the trade-off was worth it. Sandra was a high school art teacher for 27 years. She taught in the same school district the entire time, watched multiple generations of kids come through her classroom, the kind of teacher who got letters years later from former students explaining that her class had been the thing that made them understand they were allowed to make things with their hands, that creativity wasn't frivolous, that art was a language as legitimate as any other. She received those letters with a quiet, genuine pleasure that she never made a big deal of, but that I could tell meant more to her than almost anything her career had produced. She retired about 3 years before I did, and when she retired she meant it, fully and completely, in a way that I watched with a kind of admiring envy, because Sandra has always had the capacity to close a chapter and not look back at it with regret that I have spent most of my life trying to develop and still haven't quite managed. We have 2 kids. Our son, Marcus, lives in Austin, where he works in software and seems happy in ways I don't always fully understand, but am genuinely glad about. Our daughter, Erin, lives about 40 minutes from the house in Columbus, where Sandra and I lived from the time she was 7 years old, close enough that she and her husband and our 2 grandkids were part of our regular life in a way that Marcus, given the distance, simply couldn't be. Erin called frequently, visited often, and had strong opinions about everything, a trait she got from her mother, which I say with complete affection and some degree of personal understanding of what it's like to be on the receiving end of those opinions. I retired at 63. I had been planning to retire at 65, the standard sensible answer, but a restructuring at the company offered a package that made 63 the smarter financial choice. And one of the things I genuinely did get right over a 33-year career was the financial part. So I took the package, shook the hands, and walked out of that building on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, feeling a combination of lightness and complete disorientation that I hadn't been prepared for at all. I want to talk about what the first 2 years of retirement actually looked like, because I think it's important to this story, and because I suspect a lot of people reading this from the outside would assume I was fine, and the assumption would be wrong. On paper, I was fine. We had the house, paid off. We had the savings we'd built carefully for decades, enough to live on comfortably. Sandra had her garden, her reading, her friendships that had survived 30 years of her being a teacher in the same community, a genuine social fabric I admired, and had somehow never quite built for myself. I had, in theory, all the time I'd spent 33 years telling myself I didn't have enough of, and the discovery that I didn't actually know what to do with it was the kind of thing that sounds ungrateful when you say it out loud, and feels like a slow, quiet emergency when you're living inside it. I tried things. I want to be clear that I tried things. I took a woodworking class and discovered I was patient enough for the theory and not patient enough for the execution. I joined a golf league and played for about 8 months before realizing that the parts of golf I actually liked were the walking and the fresh air and the conversation, none of which actually required a golf league to access. I read more than I'd read in years, which was genuinely good, and I cooked dinner more nights than I'd cooked in the previous 3 decades. Which Sandra initially received with enthusiasm and eventually received with the diplomatic patience of someone who loves you and is choosing, consciously, not to comment on the fact that you've made the same 3 dishes in rotation for 6 months. I was present, in the house, more than I'd been in our entire marriage, and that presence, I could tell, even without either of us naming it directly, was an adjustment for both of us that we were navigating with varying degrees of grace. Sandra had built a retirement around herself, a real one, with actual architecture, routines and people and projects that gave her days shape and gave her a sense of forward motion that she clearly didn't need me to provide. I hadn't built anything yet. I was still living in the space where the job used to be, wandering around inside its absence, the way you wander around the furniture layout of a room after someone's moved everything out, bumping into corners that aren't there anymore. The Philippines entered the picture sideways, the way things that change your life usually do, not through a dramatic moment, but through an accumulating series of small ones. A friend of mine from the company, a man named Doug who'd retired 2 years before I did, had mentioned Cebu to me once, casually, over lunch about a year before I retired. Said he'd been thinking about spending some time there, that a college buddy of his had moved to the Philippines a few years earlier and could not stop talking about it. I filed it away as something vaguely interesting and forgot about it almost immediately. Then, about 18 months into my retirement, Doug actually went. He went for 6 weeks initially, came back looking, and I am not exaggerating, like someone had returned him from the factory with some parts replaced. He was lighter. That's the word I kept coming back to when I tried to describe it to Sandra. Not thinner, lighter. The way a person looks when something that was pressing down on them has been lifted off. He showed me photographs over coffee, shown with the restrained enthusiasm of a man who knows he sounds like he's been converted to something and is trying not to lead with that energy. He talked about the cost of living in terms that made me run the numbers twice in my head, about the weather, about the friendliness of the people, in ways that sounded like cliché until you heard enough specific, detailed stories that they started sounding less like talking points and more like actual reported experience. I went home and did what I always do with things that interest me, which is research them to the point where I either convince myself they're actually viable or satisfy myself that they aren't. I started reading, carefully, about the Philippines as a retirement destination, the practicalities of it, the visa options, the healthcare situation, the cost of living numbers across different cities and regions, what other expats who'd made the move actually reported after they'd been there long enough for the initial enthusiasm to settle into something more honest. I read forums and blogs and watched videos at the kitchen table late at night, and within about 3 months I had a fairly detailed picture of something that looked, to me, like a genuinely compelling option that I hadn't known existed. I brought it to Sandra the wrong way. I want to own that fully. I had done months of research on my own, had arrived at a level of certainty about the idea that felt to me like the natural endpoint of a thorough, rational process, and I presented it to her, at that kitchen table, the way you'd present a business case you'd already stress-tested and were confident in, expecting questions I already had answers for. What I hadn't accounted for was that Sandra hadn't done any of that research, hadn't taken any of that journey with me, and was therefore hearing for the first time, over pasta on a Tuesday night, that her husband of 31 years wanted to move to Southeast Asia, which, from a standing start and without context, is a sentence that lands somewhere between surprising and alarming, regardless of how well-reasoned the follow-up paragraphs are. She listened. Sandra always listens, which is one of the things that can make her hard to argue with, because she doesn't interrupt or deflect. She just absorbs everything you're saying and then responds from a place that makes clear she actually heard all of it. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was whether I had talked to Erin and Marcus about this. I had not. The second was whether I understood what I was asking her to leave. She didn't list things. She didn't say the grandkids specifically, or her garden, or her friends, or the community she'd been part of for 3 decades. She asked it as a single question, whether I understood what I was asking her to leave, and the implication was that the list was long enough and obvious enough that enumerating it would be condescending to both of us. Then she said what she said about the divorce, and she meant it, and I knew she meant it, and the conversation was over for that evening. We didn't fight about it, which people sometimes find surprising when I tell this part of the story. Sandra and I don't fight in the way some couples do, with volume and sharpness. We have disagreements that are civil and firm and occasionally go unresolved for long stretches, during which we both know perfectly well that the disagreement hasn't gone anywhere and is simply waiting. This was one of those. She knew I hadn't abandoned the idea. I knew she hadn't changed her position. We went on living in the same house, making dinner, watching television, going to errands for Sunday lunches with the grandkids, and the whole subject sat in a particular corner of every room we were in together, without either of us pointing at it. They came to visit eventually, and I could tell, the moment they landed, that they were nervous about exactly what they were going to find, having spent months imagining a version of my new life that was probably far bleaker than the reality actually turned out to be. I watched them do the thing I think every skeptical loved one does when they finally see something in person instead of hearing about it second-hand over occasional phone calls. The worry on their face slowly gave way, over the course of just a few days, to something closer to relief, and eventually something closer to genuine happiness on my behalf, watching me move through an ordinary day in a life that clearly had real shape and real people in it, not the isolated, uncertain existence they'd apparently been quietly picturing all along. On the last night of that visit, sitting together somewhere quiet, they said something that stayed with me long after they'd flown home. Some version of admitting they'd expected to find someone lonelier, smaller, more diminished than the person actually sitting in front of them. I told them that was more or less exactly what I'd feared finding in myself too, in those uncertain early months, and that I understood completely why they'd worried the way they had. But I also told them, and meant it fully, that worry built on imagination rarely survives contact with the actual lived truth of a situation, and that I was glad they'd finally gotten to see the truth of it for themselves, instead of continuing to worry about a version of my life that had never actually existed. Directly. I went to the Philippines without her. I want to be clear that I didn't do this deceptively or without telling her. I told her I was going to go and look at it properly, that I couldn't make a final decision about anything without actually seeing what I was considering, and that going to look at something was not the same as having already decided. She said she understood that logically. She also said, with the kind of precision she is capable of when she wants to be absolutely clear, that my going to look at it was going to make it more real to me, not less, and that she wanted me to understand that her position wasn't going to change because I'd seen nice photographs in person rather than on a screen. I said I understood. She wished me a safe trip and went back to her book. I flew into Manila on a direct flight from Los Angeles, and the first thing the Philippines does to you when you land is hit you with heat and noise and motion at a scale that is genuinely arresting if you haven't been there before. Manila is a city of something like 14 million people, and it feels like it, not in a hostile way exactly, more in the way that a river feels like itself, large and moving, and not particularly organized around your individual experience of it. I had arranged to be in Manila for only 2 days before heading to the Visayas region, specifically to a city called Dumaguete on the island of Negros Oriental, which had come up repeatedly in my research as a place that smaller city expats tended to gravitate toward, quieter than Cebu, with a university presence that kept it culturally active without making it overwhelming, and with a cost of living that made the numbers I'd been running feel conservative rather than optimistic. Doug's contact, the college buddy who'd made the move years earlier, was a man named Pete, a 64-year-old former accountant from Portland who had been living in Dumaguete for 4 years and had offered, with a generosity I was grateful for, to spend a few days showing me around and helping me see the place the way someone who actually lived there saw it, rather than the way a tourist would. Pete met me at the small airport when I landed, drove me into the city in his aging but functional pickup truck, and spent the first 30 minutes of the drive doing something I deeply appreciated, which was telling me the true version of things rather than the brochure version. He told me the things that annoyed him, the things he'd gotten wrong initially, the adjustments that had taken longer than he expected. He was not trying to sell me on the place, which paradoxically made everything positive he had to say about it land with significantly more weight. Dumaguete is a city of about 130,000 people situated on the coast of Negros Oriental with a view across the water to the island of Cebu. It has a promenade along the water called the Boulevard, where people walk in the evenings and sit and eat and watch the sun go down over the channel, and the atmosphere of it, the unhurried ease of it, struck me within about 20 minutes of being there as something I hadn't experienced in a very long time in my own daily life, and hadn't consciously noticed I was missing until I was suddenly sitting in the middle of it. I sat on a bench on that boulevard on my first evening there and watched the light change over the water and felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years of retirement, which was that the day had a shape that was worth inhabiting. Pete took me to the public market the next morning, a building that is both exactly what you'd expect if you've read about Asian wet markets and also nothing like what you'd expect, because the particular combination of smells and sounds and the particular energy of it, the woman calling prices over a pile of purple eggplants, the man behind the fish counter who greeted Pete by name and asked about his dog, the small coffee stalls around the perimeter serving cups of local brew for amounts that I kept doing the math on because I couldn't quite believe the numbers. All of it adds up to something that is less of an experience and more of a fact. The fact of a place that is genuinely, daily, alive in a way that I had stopped feeling about Columbus somewhere around year 3 of the job that turned into year 15 of the job. Pete introduced me to a dozen people over those 4 days, expats who'd been there various lengths of time, some American, some British, a couple from Australia, a retired Canadian couple who'd arrived 5 years earlier and were so thoroughly embedded in the community that the idea of their leaving seemed almost geographically improbable by now. I talked to all of them with the specific purpose of finding the discontented ones, the people who'd regret coming, who'd run into problems that hadn't been in the reading material, because those are the conversations that are actually useful when you're trying to make a real decision, rather than just confirming a preference you've already formed. There were legitimate complaints, the traffic in rainy season, the bureaucratic occasional headache, the way power outages still happened periodically, in ways that required adjustment, the learning curve of navigating a healthcare system as a foreigner when you need it quickly. These were real things, honestly reported, and not one of the people I talked to said any of it added up to a reason to leave or a thing they wished they'd known before they came, rather than something they'd simply learned by being there. I saw apartments. Pete showed me 3 in my first 2 days, in different parts of the city at different price points, and the numbers were so different from what I'd been paying in Columbus that I found myself doing the math multiple times just to make sure I was accounting for everything correctly. A clean, comfortable 2-bedroom with views and modern appliances for an amount that was genuinely less than what we'd been paying monthly in property taxes alone back home. I'm not saying that's the only number that matters, because it isn't, but it matters, and seeing it in person on an actual listing rather than in an online forum made it feel concrete rather than theoretical, in a way that shifted something in my thinking. I came home and made the mistake of leading with the apartment numbers when I reported back to Sandra, which was the wrong instinct, because the first thing it communicated was that I'd already been calculating what it would cost us to move, which was accurate, but not the right place to start. She listened to the whole thing, asked a few precise questions, and then said, not unkindly, that she was glad I'd had a good trip, that it sounded like a genuinely lovely place, and that she still didn't want to move there. She said it without hostility, the way you'd tell someone that you're sure the restaurant they're recommending is excellent, but you just don't want Thai food right now. Final, polite, completely immovable. I spent the next several months in a state I can only describe as suspended. I hadn't dropped the idea. She knew I hadn't dropped the idea. But I also wasn't willing to push it past the point where the marriage itself became the casualty of the argument, because that was never the version of this I was interested in. I tried to look honestly at what I was holding on to, and why, whether this was actually about the Philippines as a place, or whether it was about something else, about the retirement I'd built that didn't feel like the one I'd meant to build, about the particular hollowness of days that were comfortable and safe, and completely without the kind of engagement that makes a day feel like it was worth getting up for. Sandra saw that. She saw it more clearly than I was seeing it myself, I think, because she has that particular capacity, the ability to understand what's actually going on with me before I've finished understanding it myself, which is both one of the things that makes her remarkable and one of the things that makes her occasionally very difficult to argue with. About 3 months after my trip, she said something to me over breakfast that I've thought about many times since. She said, "I know this isn't really about the Philippines. I know it's about you not having found what you retired into yet. What I want to know is whether you're convinced that going there is actually going to fix that, or whether you're hoping it will." It was a fair question. It was a question I didn't have a fully honest answer to at the time, and I told her that, because the alternative was giving her an answer I wasn't sure I believed yet, and she would have known instantly. I told her I was maybe 65% convinced and 35% hoping, and that I thought the only way to get to a real answer was to spend more time there, long enough that the novelty wore off, and what was left underneath was either real or it wasn't. She nodded at that, and I could see her actually considering it rather than having already decided, which was a different thing from the conversations we'd been having on this topic, and I noticed it without saying anything. I went back, this time for 6 weeks. I told her the length honestly, and she didn't object to the length, which I took as a signal of something without being sure what. I went back to Dumaguete, stayed in a longer-term rental arranged through Pete, and tried to live something closer to actual daily life there rather than tourist life, cooking my own meals some nights, shopping at the market myself, navigating the city without Pete as a guide, getting lost and finding my way back, and gradually building a mental map of a place that had started, almost without my noticing it, to feel less like somewhere I was visiting and more like somewhere I actually knew. I met people on my own this time, rather than through Pete's introductions, which felt like an important distinction. I started having coffee most mornings at a small cafe near my rental, where the owner, a cheerful man in his 40s named Rico, had the kind of genuine curiosity about people that made conversation happen naturally rather than requiring effort. Within my first week, he knew roughly what I'd done for work and why I was there and what my wife's name was and whether I had children, not because he'd interrogated me, but because he asked questions the way some people do, with actual interest, and one thing led to another. Rico introduced me to a group that gathered at his place most Saturday mornings, a loose collection of locals and long-term residents who showed up mostly for the coffee and the conversation, and had been doing so for long enough that it had become one of those unplanned institutions that nobody organized and nobody wanted to be the person who let dissolve. I became a regular at that Saturday morning gathering within my first 2 weeks, and it was there that the actual shape of what the Philippines had to offer me started to become clearer than it had been on my first visit, when I'd been absorbing impressions rather than accumulating evidence. The people in that room on Saturday mornings were engaged. I don't mean cheerful, though many of them were. I mean engaged in the sense of having something to say, opinions formed from actual living in an actual place with actual stakes, debates about local politics and community issues, and which area of the city was dealing with drainage problems in typhoon season. The kind of conversation that is only possible between people who have committed themselves to a place rather than passing through it. An American named Gary, who'd been in Dumaguete for 7 years, had started a small social enterprise, connecting local craftspeople with international buyers. Not a large operation, not a profitable one in any way that would impress an accountant, but a functioning one that kept him busy 3 or 4 days a week and gave him the specific satisfaction of work that was useful to people who weren't him. He was 69 years old and sharper and more present than I'd been in my last 3 years of a career I'd supposedly excelled at. I asked him once, during a Saturday morning that went long enough that Rico had to start hinting about lunch, whether he thought the place had made him that way or whether he'd just gotten lucky and happened to bring that quality with him. He thought about it for a moment and said, "I think the place demanded it. I think there's something about being somewhere new enough that you actually have to pay attention to it. Back home, I could get through a whole week on autopilot. Here, I still can't, even after 7 years. I'm still learning things. I think that's the whole point." I called Sandra twice a week during those 6 weeks, real conversations, not check-ins. I described things in detail because I wanted her to have a picture of it that was actual rather than theoretical, and she listened in the way she always listens, completely, without filling in her own narrative over the top of mine. She asked about the healthcare situation, to Gunaif, because that was always going to be her most legitimate practical concern, and she was right to keep coming back to it. I had done significant reading on this, and I gave her real answers. The name of the private hospital in the city, the actual reported experiences of people I'd spoken to directly, the cost comparison numbers that were harder to argue with the more you looked at them. She didn't say she was convinced, but she stopped asking the same healthcare question and started asking different ones, which I took as meaning she'd heard enough on that particular point to set it aside and was now looking for the next one. The thing that happened on that second trip that I haven't talked about yet, because I've been working up to it, is that I found something I actually wanted to do. I want to explain this carefully because it matters more than everything else in this story, including the cost of living numbers and the weather and the size of the apartment and all of it. None of the logistics would have meant anything if not for this. About 3 weeks into my 6-week stay, Rico mentioned that a woman named Ligaya, who ran an informal after-school tutoring program for kids from lower-income families in the area, was struggling to find anyone who could help with math at the upper secondary level, the kind of applied mathematics that starts to require more than basic literacy to explain well. I had, as part of 33 years in logistics management, spent a significant portion of my career working with numbers in ways that were genuinely practical, cost modeling, supply chain optimization, the kind of applied quantitative thinking that is not glamorous but is very real and learnable and translatable to someone who has the patience to learn it. I didn't volunteer immediately. I thought about it for 2 days, which is roughly how long it takes me to talk myself into anything I actually want to do, but am cautious about wanting. I went on a Wednesday afternoon, mostly because I'd told Rico I'd go, and couldn't face his gentle disappointment if I backed out. Ligaya's program operated out of a community space, 2 streets off the main boulevard, about 20 kids ranging in age from 14 to 17, sitting on mismatched chairs at mismatched tables with the specific focused energy of young people who are choosing to be somewhere after school because they actually want to be there rather than because they have to be, which, if you've ever spent time around teenagers, you know is not the energy you always get. I sat down with the ones who were working on algebra and asked them what they were stuck on, and spent 2 hours working through problems in a way that I have not worked through anything in 2.5 years of retirement, with the specific concentration that comes from being actually needed rather than just present. I drove back to my rental that evening and sat on the small balcony and understood, clearly, possibly for the first time since I'd handed in my access badge and left my office for the last time in Columbus, that I had not been missing logistics. I had been missing being useful. I had been missing the experience of being somewhere, because the being there actually mattered to something or someone beyond my own effort to fill the day. I had been retired from a job for 2.5 years and had, in that time, successfully managed to stay busy and stay comfortable and stay close to everything familiar, and had somehow, in doing all of that correctly, managed to build a life that felt, most days, like it was happening in a waiting room. I called Sandra the next night and told her about Ligaya's program, not in a strategic way, not as an argument for the move, just because it was the thing that had happened that day that was worth talking about. Sandra asked good questions, The kind she asks when she's actually interested, specific ones, about how Ligaya had started the program, and where the funding came from, and what the kids were working toward. I answered what I could, and told her honestly what I didn't know yet. She was quiet for a moment, and then said, "So you found something?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was the kind of statement she makes when she's identified the relevant fact and is sitting with it. I said yes. She said she was glad. We talked about other things. I went to bed that night understanding that something had changed, though I couldn't have said precisely what. I went back to Ligaya's program every Wednesday and every Saturday for the remaining 3 weeks of my stay. By my last week, I was working regularly with 4 kids in particular, including a 15-year-old girl named Maribel, who had the specific combination of genuine aptitude and total lack of confidence in that aptitude that I recognized from watching my daughter at the same age, and who, by my 4th session with her, was solving problems she'd told me she couldn't do on the first day. She showed me a test paper on my last Saturday, a score she was proud of, and I felt something about that score that I had not felt in professional work in longer than I wanted to admit. I told her she'd done the work herself, that I'd just sat next to her while she figured out she already knew how. She said, "Seriously, you're coming back, right?" I told her I was planning on it. I meant it. I flew home with that certainty in my chest, alongside everything else, and I told Sandra about Maribel on the drive from the airport. And I told her about the Saturday morning group at Rico's, and about Gary and his craft enterprise, and about the boulevard at sunset, and about the specific quality of an evening in Dumaguete, when the temperature drops slightly, and the whole city seems to exhale at once, and find itself outside in the street and along the water, the way that only happens in places where the evening is an event, rather than just the end of the afternoon. I didn't make an argument. I just described what I'd actually experienced, as accurately as I could, and let her have her own reaction to it. She was quiet for most of the drive. When we pulled into our street in Columbus, she said, "I want to go and see it." Just that. I looked at her for a moment, because I wanted to make sure I'd heard what I thought I'd heard, and she looked back at me with the expression that means she's said what she meant and doesn't need me to respond to it with more words than necessary. I said when. "Shh," she said soon. We went inside, and she made tea, and I told her more about Ligaya's program, the specifics this time, and she listened with the particular quality of attention that means she's actually building a picture rather than just receiving information. We went together 3 months later. I want to be careful about how I describe Sandra's experience of that first trip, because the story of it is really hers to tell, and I don't have full access to the inside of it, only the outside, what I observed. I watched her the way you watch someone you know very well when they're encountering something genuinely new, the particular combination of alertness and wariness that comes from being somewhere your guard is up, but the place keeps doing things that lower it anyway. The flight didn't bother her. She's always been a better traveler than me, more adaptable in the moment, less attached to the immediate comfort of familiarity. She took Manila in stride, noted specific things about it, the way she notices things in cities, the street food vendors at every corner, the particular way color was used on storefronts, the mosaic quality of a city where 10 centuries of influence have been layered imperfectly on top of each other. Dumaguete she responded to differently from how I'd expected. I'd been prepared for her to be impressed by the obvious things, the boulevard at sunset, the general beauty of the waterfront, the price tags that kept requiring recalculation. What she was most obviously affected by was the people, which I should have predicted, because Sandra has always been more interested in people than in places, as places, and Dumaguete's most effective argument for itself is the quality of the daily human interaction it contains. Rico greeted me back, like I'd been a regular for years, rather than a 6-week visitor, and he greeted Sandra as though she were someone he'd heard good things about and was genuinely pleased to finally meet, which was both true and delivered in a way that communicated itself without needing translation. She sat in his cafe for 3 hours that first full day, long past when she'd intended to, because the conversation kept finding new directions, and she has never been able to walk away from a conversation that has more in it. She met Ligaya on the 3rd day, and I could see from the first 5 minutes that these were 2 women who were going to understand each other immediately and thoroughly, in the way that only certain people can, when they encounter someone whose values and approach to the world are organized around the same central things. They talked for 2 hours, mostly without me, and when we left that meeting, Sandra was quiet in a way I recognized, the quiet of someone who has encountered a perspective that is actively rearranging something. I didn't ask what they'd talked about. I knew she'd tell me when she was ready. She told me that evening on the boulevard, watching the light on the water, that Ligaya had talked about the community the program was building, not just for the kids, but for the volunteers, the way it created a network of people who were invested in something beyond themselves, who showed up because they'd chosen to, and who kept showing up because the choosing mattered. Sandra had spent 27 years building exactly that in a high school art classroom, and she said that sitting across from Ligaya, she'd found herself thinking about what it would feel like to build something like that again, smaller and different, but built on the same principle, that showing up for people who need what you have to offer is not a minor thing. It is, in fact, the thing. She asked to see Maribel. I had mentioned her enough that Sandra wanted to see who she was, and I arranged, through Ligaya, for us to go by on a Saturday morning. Maribel is 15, compact and serious-faced in the way of kids who take themselves seriously because they've learned they have to, and she shook Sandra's hand when I introduced them with a formality that Sandra met perfectly, and then the 2 of them, unprompted by either of us, ended up sitting together at a table with a geometry problem Maribel had been stuck on, and Sandra, who has been explaining visual and spatial things to teenagers for nearly 3 decades, had Maribel through it in about 20 minutes. I sat across the room and watched that happen, and tried not to be obvious about what I was feeling, which was something close to relief, and something close to love, for both of them, and something I couldn't quite name for the situation itself, the particular rightness of watching 2 people find each other useful. Sandra was quiet on the drive back. After a while, she said, "I see what you mean." I didn't say anything. She said, "I still have concerns." I said I knew. She said, "I want to think about this properly." I said, "Of course." She looked out the window at the city going by, and I drove, and we didn't talk about it for the rest of that day, because some conversations need to be had with more than a car ride's worth of space. We had those conversations over the remaining days of the trip, and then over the weeks after we got home, real ones, the kind where both people are actually trying to work through something together rather than win the argument. Sandra's concerns were legitimate and specific, and I want to name them honestly rather than glossing over them, because they were real concerns, and the fact that they got resolved doesn't mean they weren't worth taking seriously. She was worried about Erin, not just about the distance in the abstract, but about the specific texture of their relationship, the Sunday lunches, the proximity to the grandkids, the fact of being the mother and grandmother who was around the corner rather than 8,000 miles away. She was worried about what it would mean to be somewhere that far from Erin if something happened, on either end, the kind of something that requires presence rather than phone calls. She was worried, honestly, about herself, about who she would be, somewhere she didn't know anyone, and couldn't yet speak the language, and couldn't find the things she needed without help, and had not yet built any of the invisible infrastructure of a life, the preferred grocery store, the doctor you trust, the neighbor who knows your name, the route you walk, that you know so well your feet take it on their own. She had spent 27 years building that in Columbus, and the idea of dismantling it was not abstract for her the way it had been for me, because I had never fully built it, had always been the person who traveled more than he stayed, for whom home was where Sandra was, rather than where he'd put down the particular individual roots she had put down. She understood that what she was being asked to do was categorically harder for her than what I had done, and she needed me to understand that too, which I did, eventually, though I want to be honest and say that it took me some time to fully appreciate that the differentness of what the move asked of each of us was real, and not just a negotiating position. We talked about Erin directly, not around her. We talked with Erin, who had been kept aware of all of this, and who had, over the preceding months, moved from an initial alarm through a long middle period of careful watching and into something closer to genuine consideration of what this would mean rather than reflexive opposition to it. Erin is like Sandra in many ways, the capacity to sit with a hard thing and actually think about it rather than just feel about it. And what she said, eventually, after several conversations, was that she wanted her mother to be somewhere that made her mother happy, not just somewhere convenient. That proximity without purpose was not the same thing as being present, and that she would rather have parents who were genuinely living a life 8,000 miles away than parents who were physically 30 minutes from her, but quietly hollowed out. She said this with the kind of calm that meant she'd thought it through rather than just said it for our benefit, and Sandra heard it as such. Marcus, predictably perhaps, was the easier sell. He's always been comfortable with distance, in a way that his sister isn't, partly temperament and partly circumstance, and when we talked to him, he asked the practical questions in the same way my son always asks the practical questions. And once the practical questions had been satisfied, he said something I found unexpectedly generous, that he thought going somewhere new at 68 was actually the braver and more interesting version of getting older than the alternative, and that he was proud of us for it. Sandra laughed when he said that, the specific laugh she has when someone surprises her in a good way, and I filed it away as a small additional thing to be grateful to Marcus for. Sandra made a list. I say this with genuine affection because the list-making is one of the things I love about her, the willingness to take the thing that feels overwhelming and reduce it to items that can be addressed one at a time. She listed everything she was afraid of or uncertain about, grouped them into things that were solvable with research and things that would only be resolved by actual experience of being there, and then addressed the first group systematically over about 6 weeks. She talked to Pete's wife, a woman named Joanna, who had moved with Pete 4 years earlier and who had, Sandra later told me, answered her questions with exactly the honesty she needed, rather than the reassurance Sandra wouldn't have believed anyway. She researched the healthcare situation herself, independently, because she needed to reach her own conclusions about it, rather than accept mine. She looked into what the visa process actually required, and what the timeline was, and what it would mean for If any part of this sounds like where you are right now, sitting somewhere quiet, wondering what's actually left to look forward to, I hope this gave you something to hold on to, even if it's small. It doesn't have to look like what I did. It doesn't have to be dramatic or far away or anything close to what you're picturing right now as you sit with this. But I do think it has to be something, some door you're willing to walk through even while you're not entirely sure what's waiting on the other side of it, because certainty, in my experience, almost never arrives before the decision does. It arrives after, once you've already taken the step and given yourself enough time to see what it actually leads to. I wish someone had told me that plainly years ago, instead of leaving me to wait around for a certainty that was never going to show up first. So if you're waiting for that certainty before you let yourself change anything, I gently suggest you might be waiting for something that simply doesn't come in the order you're expecting it to.